Hello, and welcome to today's video. In today's video I'm going to be discussing how to protect your children from the octopus. If you don't know what the octopus is, check out the Forbidden Text, The Octopus. That's a very good article, I'll link it in the description. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about how your children can be protected from ideas that as sensible centrists we wouldn't want our children to be exposed to, whether that's from the school or their peer group. I'm going to be discussing it in terms of schools, but I am going to mention things like peer group because I think peer group is very important to, if not it's the most important factor in determining your child's morals, especially when they're young. Right, I'm going to talk about this in a UK context. In state schools, and in all schools in the UK for that matter, SRE is mandatory. That means there is no way of getting out of it, and it's mandatory from the age of 5, reception age. However, as a parent you can complain about the SRE curriculum, and there is statutory guidance on how that's necessary primary legislation and statute should be interpreted, and the government guidance is schools are meant to consult parents. So if you're a parent and you cannot afford any of the other options which I'm going to detail later in this video, asking to see the SRE programme and anything else that they might be teaching the kids as part of wider learning, as I believe it's called, and complaining about it. Complaining about it, it will mean that someone has to spend the time addressing your complaint, and if you keep furthering the complaints, eventually what will happen is a change might happen because your complaint might get upheld. Complaining to your state school will only get you so far because there are quite teaching children about topics that sensibly centrist parents would find objectionable has quite a strong basis in law, whether it's from certain sections of the Equalities Act or the Education Act or other primary legislation that requires schools to teach kids about equality, diversity and other things that sensible centrists would find objectionable. What can be done after complaining is you need to look at the issue from a school's point of view. There's statutory guidance and regulations that require schools to do certain things, like SRE and wider learning programmes. Normally a teacher and a school will adopt a pre-made wider learning programme because teachers don't get paid extra for doing things like that. It might help their career, but normally they'll buy a new one or buy a pre-made one, such as No Outsiders. The thing is, what I'm going to suggest as the solution to that is quite impractical for most people. I would suggest that sensible centrists need to make their own SRE curriculum. However, the problem with that is it's incredibly difficult, and it shouldn't be overtly political or overtly centrist. Sorry, I got tongue-tied there. But that's the main things you can do to stop your child learning about things and discussing things in school, at least from the teacher's point of view, that you shouldn't be learning, or your children shouldn't be learning. I'm going to move on to your child's peer group. The problem is you cannot really control your child's peer group when they're in a state school. So it's quite difficult. And if you come between your child and friends, especially when they're a teenager, your relationship with your child will probably suffer from it. I'm going to tell a little story about one of my friends, or two of my friends, who I went to high school with, who were Jehovah's Witnesses. And this story should explain what I'm on about. One of the Jehovah's Witnesses was allowed to play rugby and everything else and join in with normal social activities. This person is now not a Jehovah's Witness. His parents are, but he's left the faith of a Jehovah's Witness. The other Jehovah's Witness attended the state school, but wasn't allowed to do after school clubs because he would be evangelizing and going to try and convert people into being a Jehovah's Witness. This person, as far as I know, is still a Jehovah's Witness. If your child's peer group can be controlled, or the amount of time your child spends with non-sensibly centrist people can be controlled, and that doesn't cause difficulties with your relationship with your child, that's probably the best way of ensuring your child doesn't end up becoming part of the octopus and engaging in octopus ideas. That's it for state schools. I'll move on to homeschooling. In my opinion, homeschooling is probably the best way to ensure your child isn't exposed to people predicating octopus ideas, posed ideas, and also your child will probably get a better education if you're an intelligent person. The difficulty is, and I know this is a difficulty for some people, homeschooling normally requires one parent not to work, which isn't necessarily an option for some people, which I understand. But a lot of the options I'm going to suggest in this video, especially the options that I will suggest are more effective, do have a barrier to entry, and that barrier to entry is quite substantial in terms of costs. So homeschooling is probably the best way of ensuring that your child doesn't have friends or be introduced to ideas that you would consider damaging. The plus side about homeschooling is, if your child isn't at school, you can have better control of who they socialise with. So you can socialise your child with people who share your beliefs. This gets harder as your child gets older, but if you could, from what I've noticed with kids I know who have been homeschooled, if the children have a very strong relationship that they've built on for years with somebody who also shares their views, who is also the child of sensibly centrist parents, that relationship has every likelihood of lasting into adulthood. Another issue really with homeschooling is, in the UK, the conversation has been had about banning it. There are no plans, as far as I'm aware, to plan homeschooling, but there are whispers of it. So if your child's being homeschooled, you might get stopped from homeschooling your child for whatever reason. Boarding school abroad. I would say that boarding school abroad is probably the second best, or probably is, in terms of effectiveness, probably up there with homeschooling. When I'm on about sending your child to a boarding school abroad, I'm ideally on about an English-speaking boarding school that teaches the English-speaking system. You can find those kind of boarding schools all over the world, from the UAE to Asia and other places. They can be quite expensive, so there is an economic barrier that is substantial, but it might not be as expensive as a boarding school in the UK. It really depends. What I'm getting at with this point is, in a lot of countries like the Middle East, like Asia, SRE programs are either very small c conservative, or they're banned outright. So your child is very unlikely to be exposed to harmful ideas about sexuality, race and other things from the school. We'll move on to your child's peer group as well. Normally, the type of people who send their kids to offshore boarding schools or boarding schools abroad that are using the English system are normally quite conservative. So there's a very high probability that your child is not going to be exposed, or will be exposed to a lesser extent than they otherwise would be, if they're attending an English-speaking, English educational system boarding school in the Middle East, Asia or Africa or wherever. Obviously there are problems that may occur because it being a school that you don't have very much control over who your child spends their time with. But what I would say for boarding schools abroad, normally the children will be more conservative, and there's another thing that is important for boarding schools as well. Most boarding schools these days do not allow children to have, or their students to have, unsupervised access all the time to electronic devices. There's one boarding school, actually a couple that I've looked at, that ban smartphones and personal devices completely, but most boarding schools, even boarding schools in the UK actually, don't allow children to watch Netflix, have unsupervised access to YouTube or the internet. So what I would say here is this is probably going to be a good thing, because if your child doesn't have access to TikTok or any social media whatsoever, they're very unlikely to be introduced to harmful ideas. And if it's the same for your child's friends, which it will be in a lot of cases, your child is probably less likely to be exposed to that type of content. Public or religious schools. Sorry, I wrote cool on the slide instead of school, but I suppose public and religious schools are quite cool. Ba-boom. Right, public schools and religious schools, here I'm talking about the UK or whatever country you're in. As I've mentioned previously, most public schools don't allow children to have unsupervised access to smartphones. But if it's a public school or a day school, actually not public school, if it's a day school instead of a boarding school, your child may have peer pressure issues with not having a smartphone if you choose to not allow your children to have a smartphone or other mobile device, which I would recommend actually, because your child's not going to do anything sensible with a smartphone or mobile device, or even if they do, the stupid things they'll do on it that may affect them for the rest of their life far outweighs any good your child could do. If you want to allow your child to do research on the internet, have a family computer that's checked regularly, or have it in a public place within the house so you can supervise what your child's doing. Part of me wishes that I'd had that growing up, because I'm 21 and my age group were the first age group, or one of the first age groups, to get random access to smartphones and unsupervised access to smartphones. And some of the stuff that I got up to and classmates got up to is quite silly and very stupid, and as an adult now I wish I hadn't had access to that. But if they're at a day school, even if it's a religious or public school, there will be an issue with your child not having a smartphone if you choose not to let them have a smartphone. Most public schools and most religious schools do not allow unsupervised access to the internet. But if your child does have to have a mobile device, which some schools require, if your child's got half a brain, they'll use a VPN so they can look at whatever they want using the school Wi-Fi. I know I certainly did when I was a teenager. I know lots of people did. So I would say that religious or public schools, if they're day schools, are probably less effective in terms of stopping your child from accessing things that you would deem harmful. And also it's a requirement for all schools in the UK to teach SRE. If your school is a religious school, that SRE curriculum may be particularly or less harmful than it would be in a public school or a non-religious school. Sorry, I'm interchanging terms between public school and state school. But yes, if your child is doing SRE in a state school, the material they're taught in a state school will probably be worse than they would otherwise get in a public school. But public schools, as I've said, are quite expensive. So I appreciate that not everyone can do that. thank you very much for watching. I'm going to link an article which I wrote a couple of months ago, which explains the legal basis for all of this. So I'd recommend you watch it, because I go through the necessary legislation and go through the guidance or statutory guidance issued by the government to schools on how the statute should be interpreted. And hopefully that will help you understand why and how your child is exposed to certain things that you would find disgusting or disgraceful. Please check out my links if you want to improve your public speaking skills. As my locals channel as well. So thank you very much. Have a nice day.